The end to the war. So we're going to actually jump back to politics for just a second, jump out of the war. Looking at the election of 1864, we're going to see that Democrats are going to nominate George B. McClellan. Hey, you should recognize his name. He was the former commander of the Union's armies. He is going to try to appeal as the party of peace and tries to also appeal to the anti-emancipation sentiment that was really strong in actually parts of the North. However, with Atlanta falling to Union forces, this basically undermined any Democratic prospect. We're going to see with this election, Lincoln is going to capture 55% of the popular vote, only losing New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. Republicans are going to sweep also congressional elections, meaning that they're going to retain control of the Senate and the House. So first of all, this means Lincoln is now the president for the next 4 years, and he has a Republican Congress as well to work with him, but this also means this is going to reinforce the Union's commitment to emancipation. And so this is when we get the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, completely passed in January 31st of 1865. This frees all enslaved throughout the United States. So now we can say there are no more slaves in the United States. Jumping back to the war, though, we have to look at Sherman's march to the sea. Basically, Sherman and his troops are going to march to the sea. They're going to destroy everything in their path along the way. His force of about 60,000 men faced very little resistance, but even this was very strategic in that they broke up into different groups and they didn't want the so-called Confederacy to ever know exactly where they were going next. But after he makes it to the ocean, he heads north into South Carolina, which is what many would consider the heart of the so-called Confederacy. I mean, think about how many things South Carolina was involved in the lead up to the Civil War and everything, and they were the first to secede. There, Sherman's troops would push aside a smaller force that had assembled to try to oppose them, and then they wreaked even greater destruction on South Carolina than they had in Georgia. We're going to see things like the burning of the state capital of Columbia, and in fact, Sherman purposely ordered his black troops to be the first to take possession of the city, trying to add just a little salt to the wound there. All of this ends in March in North Carolina in 1865. We see also Lincoln is going to take his oath of office for the second time in 1865, and basically by that point, the result of the Civil War is a foregone conclusion that the Union is going to win. However, trying to put off this, Confederate leaders in March of 1865 actually revived a proposal that had been previously rejected to free and arm slaves. There was two reasons for this. One was hoping for a military benefit of having more soldiers by arming former slaves. And then they were hoping for diplomatic recognition from countries that had kind of balked previously because of their use of slavery. The thing is, it really was too little too late, because slaves themselves greeted the proposal with very little enthusiasm. By that point, the 13th Amendment was already put forward in the Union, and so many enslaved individuals considered themselves free, even if they hadn't necessarily escaped to freedom quite yet. And while this might have been acceptable earlier in the war, it really wasn't now that the Union's victory was imminent. The thing is, even with this proposal, in 1865, the Confederate Congress is going to pass a bill to enlist black soldiers, but without offering their freedom. So even at the end, the so-called Confederacy could not give up slavery. That's how much slavery had to do with what they viewed as Southern society. 10 days later, though, President Davis of the so-called Confederacy is going to issue a general order that promises the immediate freedom to enslaved individuals who enlist, but basically the war ends before it has any effect at all. Which brings us to Appomattox. The thing is, Lee's army is really the last obstacle at this point in time. Now, Lee is going to try to go westward to join up with Johnston's army of Tennessee and North Carolina to maybe continue the fight, but in doing so, this means he has to abandon Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the so-called Confederacy. So this means that Davis and his cabinet are going to have to flee Richmond towards North Carolina. Union troops would then go on to occupy the Confederate capital on April 3rd, and Lincoln will walk through its streets to cheers from his army, as well as just a really emotional reception from like thousands of black people. Grant's army is going to be cut off, though. Grant's army is going to cut off Lee's diminishing force by the time they get to Appomattox Courthouse. At this point, Lee was convinced that further resistance was futile, and the Confederate commander is going to meet with Grant on April 9th of 1865 at McLean House at Appomattox to sign documents of surrender. I have a couple stories here. First of all, if you ever get a chance to go to Appomattox Courthouse and everything, I would definitely recommend going. They've actually transformed it into a museum, and I went as a child, and one of the really interesting things that was there when I went was they had a doll on display under really low lights so that it didn't fall apart and everything and break down. And so basically what happened was when the Confederate forces were signing these documents of surrender, there were some Union soldiers standing around in the house, and this was a house that like a family lived in, and there was a little doll sitting on the couch. And so the Union officers actually started tossing the doll around, saying that it was like the silent witness to all these documents. And one of the Union soldiers actually like put it in his coat and stole it. Yes, he stole a doll from this house. He then passed it down for generations it was always going to the oldest male in his family line. However, at some point there wasn't a man to pass it through, and so when it went to the oldest girl, she immediately donated it to the museum. So there you go. The other thing is, jumping back though into history, the Union General Grant is going to offer really generous terms to Lee and his men. He, for instance, allowed them to go home unmolested, take with them horses and mules so they could put them to crop. A lot of this is going to be about like, oh, we are all Americans, so we need to allow you to go home and start the healing process. And on one hand, this is really an interesting moment in history, because you could say this is an ideal moment, because here was a moment that on some level the North could have taken revenge against the South, and they chose not to. But then it's also problematic, because some historians have pointed out that there's some issues with this moment, because by allowing them to go home unmolested and really on some level not face any consequences as we get into Reconstruction, they really won't face a lot of consequences. There's an element that we see here. The South isn't necessarily punished for what they do, and so they're allowed to write history afterward and cause the mythos of the lost cause, which I'm going to get into later. And so this allows people in the South to believe what they did wasn't necessarily wrong and not a mistake that they need to learn from. So it's a very complicated moment, because on one hand it could be idolized, but on the other hand it can be seen as problematic for the results in the future. And I want you thinking about that because this is a complicated situation of where do you fall on that. Going further, though, we're going to see then Johnston, another Confederate general, is going to surrender to Sherman in North Carolina. And then Union cavalry would go on to capture President Davis in Georgia. Then Texas General Kirby Smith would surrender his Trans-Mississippi Army, and at that point the Civil War comes to an end. We do have Lincoln speaking out briefly of plans of reconstructing the South, especially with help of persons loyal to the Union, including former slaves. But some people of the South are not impressed. One of which is John Wilkes Booth. On February 14th, Good Friday, President Lincoln attended Ford's Theater, and during a performance, John Wilkes Booth shot the president, wounding him mortally, and then jumped from Lincoln's box to the stage, and he shouted "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which translates "thus ever to tyrants." The idea behind this is popular culture. Supposedly, Brutus said this when he stabbed Julius Caesar back in like the Roman Empire, and so it's the idea is if you're a tyrant, this is what you get. From there, John Wilkes Booth fled the theater. Also, fascinating place to go. If you ever are in Washington, D.C., go to Ford's Theater. Fascinating museum. It's really interesting. They have, for instance, when John Wilkes Booth jumped to the stage, his heel actually caught on the American flag and it ripped it down the middle. And they have that flag on display in the basement of Ford's Theater. The thing is, John Wilkes Booth then would be tracked down to a barn in North Virginia, and then he would be killed when people were trying to take him in. They then find 8 other accomplices in this conspiracy, and 4 of them were hanged. If you go to Ford's Theater, the museum, it's really fascinating. They, when they hung these men, and there was a woman that was hung as well, they actually had hoods they put over their head before they hung them, and they still have those hoods down in the basement. The South is going to have some mixed emotions when it came to Lincoln's assassination. Now, some felt relief, but others were really aware that Lincoln really was a moderating influence on the more radical elements of the Republican Party that are pressing for much harsher terms against the South. So I also want to point out here, this is one of those moments that we don't know how Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction afterwards. But remember, Lincoln really opposed slavery, but he wasn't necessarily for equality between black and white people. And so I want you kind of thinking about that and how that might have affected him had he lived during the era after the Civil War. So I ask you these 2 questions as a part of your journal. First of all, do you think, was it ever possible for the so-called Confederacy to win the Civil War? And then the second one here is a kind of what if. I'm curious to see where you fall in this argument. If the so-called Confederacy had won the Civil War, do you think that slavery would exist today? Why or why not?